Hi everyone, this is your host Annie Zhang, and this is Hello Metaverse. As of late, other than the unfortunate plummeting prices of cryptocurrencies, OpenSea has been perhaps the biggest news story in blockchain tech. The world's largest NFT marketplace has just raised a new Series C venture funding round, valuing it at $13.3 billion. If you're skeptical about its new colossal valuation, here's a stat for you. The platform experienced $14 billion in trading volume in 2021, which is more than a 40,000% increase from a trading volume of just 33 million the year prior in 2020. In this episode, I speak with Devin Finzer, who is the CEO and co-founder of OpenSea. For those unfamiliar with the platform, OpenSea is the first and largest peer-to-peer marketplace for blockchain-based assets. Whether it's a Bored Ape, indie, NFT art, or items in the sandbox, you can buy it all on OpenSea. As cheeky as buying and selling million-dollar Bored Ape profile photos sound, the key thing is that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what actually could be an NFT. Devin likes to remind people that while there's a lot of hype around digital art, NFTs could literally be anything. The way I like to view it is, in the same way Amazon started as an online bookseller and no one anticipated the way in which it would completely change our lifestyles and how the world works, OpenSea has the potential to do the same in the digital world. In today's episode, we will get a better sense of the current landscape, or should I say Seascape, of OpenSea, and where the greater NFT ecosystem at large is headed. As a disclosure, all opinions and points of view in this podcast are my own. It does not represent the views of Roblox, my current employer, and is not affiliated with the company. Now here is my conversation with Devin Finzer. OpenSea started in 2017 when it was sort of the ICO mayhem and nobody was really talking about consumer use cases of the blockchain. And so how did you formulate the hypothesis around NFTs and how did you have conviction around the idea to begin with?
I think a lot of it just stemmed from what we were most curious about as folks who had built more consumer-facing products, myself at Pinterest and Credit Karma. It was just more exciting to build something that could be used by potentially billions of people in the world, as opposed to something that was more oriented purely around trading or speculation. Not that there aren't, really exciting businesses to be built in that area, but it just seemed like there was this idea in the community around tech crypto versus finance crypto, the latter being primarily around sort of economic theory and how Bitcoin might change some of those dynamics. And then the tech crypto philosophy was more like, okay, how could this reimagine the entire internet and all of the different applications that we use today? So that sort of idea was more interesting to us. And then when CryptoKitties hit in 2017, it was a really cool moment because for the first time, people were interacting with what people call like a dApp and downloading a wallet, buying their first CryptoKitty, and NFTs were like, this kind of use case that was not purely financial, but at that time was really around gaming. So we saw that and said, oh, let's, go and try to build something here.
That's awesome. Well, I'm kind of curious. I actually don't know. Where's the origin of the NFT term? Who came up with that?
Yeah, I believe it was the CryptoKitties team. They put together a standard called ERC 721, which is used to represent this non-fungible token. I think there was some early debate around whether non-fungible token was a good way to describe it versus something else. But, for better or for worse, it was kind of the thing that stuck around. To dive into a little bit of the technical weeds, there's a bunch of different standards on Ethereum for representing digital items. And one of the first was ERC20, which is used to represent currencies. And CryptoKitties was like, oh, maybe we need a new standard to represent things that are non-fungible and not interchangeable. And so it's interesting that it sort of started with these fungible currencies and then evolved into these non-fungible items.
Interesting. Can you give us a sense of what the current landscape of OpenSea looks like? I mean, a lot of people have actually heard of it, but I don't know if they understand, who really are the core users and what are the key things that are being transacted onto the platform. So maybe give us a picture of that.
Sure. Perhaps we should call it a seascape, not a landscape. But who are the core users today? So I would break it into maybe two groups. One is folks who are creating content or creating NFTs, and then the other is people who are buying and selling them. And of course, those two groups overlap. The folks who are buying and selling, it still is the case that a lot of the people who use NFTs today are crypto native. What's exciting is that more and more of them have maybe recently become crypto native. NFTs are becoming kind of a gateway into this new world of Web3. That being said, I do think that it still requires a lot of learning and overhead to understand how to use NFTs and get a wallet and get cryptocurrency. So I would say that the user base of NFTs is people who are a little bit tech forward and are willing to go through some of those steps. On the creator side, there's really a huge diversity of folks. So, there are individual artists, musicians, creators who are just, minting their works and making things that are appealing to their fan bases. There are game developers who are using NFTs as items inside of their games. There are maybe more crypto native developers who are thinking about more crazier ideas around DAOs and communities. And there's people creating sort of event ticketing projects, so startups doing things. So it's a really wide diversity of folks who are getting deeper into NFTs and building things. It's a very vibrant community when it comes to kind of the number of builders.
And are there like native NFT builders at this point? So are there people who are like exclusively creating art for OpenSea?
Yeah, for sure. So a good example is one artist that we worked with a while back, whose name is Josie Bellini. She was on the cutting edge of NFT art. So her art is very crypto centric. There's a lot of Bitcoin, Ethereum themes. For a while, I don't know if she was doing it full time or not, but that was like an area where she was just investing so much of her time and really like thinking through how to distribute these things, how to appeal to an early collector base. And so, yeah, there are certainly folks on the creator side that are doing this full time. And then there are, of course, companies that are embracing NFTs for their project or their game. So I think it's motivating a lot of different people to get really deep into the space.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what would you say is the fastest emerging vertical right now on the platform? You mentioned, gaming, ticketing, music, stuff like that.
Well, I would say probably the fastest emerging vertical is the profile picture collectible items area. So, that started with CryptoPunks, which was really the first NFT on Ethereum. And it sort of pioneered this idea of, almost like a digital antique that has lasted for many years now. And, now regularly CryptoPunks sell for millions of dollars. And that got people thinking about, well, there's this whole interesting community around CryptoPunks that has evolved. Could there be other communities where maybe the barrier to entry isn't hundreds of thousands of dollars, but rather maybe there's a different community that could kind of emerge around another set of NFTs. So one of the projects that amplified that was Bored Ape Yacht Club, which started maybe 6 months or longer ago now. But that was really this kind of interesting community of folks that has persisted over time and grown. And now a lot of celebrities have bought Bored Apes, for example, and mainstream brands have started working with Bored Ape Yacht Club. And so it sort of emerged in this grassroots way. And so those projects, there's a lot of those, and they've been probably the ones to point to in terms of what has driven the recent explosion of excitement. That being said, I do think things like gaming are maybe earlier in some sense, but we're seeing a ton of activity from really exciting game developer studios going after this idea of having an open economy for your game.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm super excited to dive into gaming. But really quickly on the whole profile photo thing, for a while, it didn't make sense. But when I think about when I was younger, I remember in high school, like everyone would try to be friends with a photographer who was really good at taking headshots, because then you'd have the coolest like profile photo on Facebook or something like that. And by nature of who is friends with the photographer, they're probably cooler. And so you could immediately tell going on Facebook, like these are the cool kids of the high school. And I almost feel like that's the exact equivalent with Bored Yacht Club right now, or any profile related art.
Yeah.
Well, let's switch gears and talk higher level about why people are starting to value intangible assets so much, or virtual assets. Obviously, like hype is a huge part of it. Social status is a huge part of it. And then also just like fundamentally the non-fungible part of the token, right? It's something that's unique in itself. I just wonder, like, can you talk about what is driving the speculation and the hype currently? And what are some of the cultural shifts that have happened that led to this?
One starting place is people have valued intangible or digital items for a long time. Obviously, domain names, if you think about Amazon.com or Google.com, right, are digital items which have sold for millions of dollars, and they're inherently kind of useful in the internet. Or if you think about game items, right, people have been buying items inside of video games, Fortnite, for example, for a long time now. So I think the big unlock was having digital items that were much more persistent, much more immutable, and worked across all sorts of applications and weren't isolated to a specific piece of software or application. So those new attributes of digital items have driven the cultural shift towards realizing that, wow, digital items could actually be really valuable because they're not going to go away. Whereas before it was like, okay, domain names aren't going to go away. But if you think about video game items or like digital art, didn't really make sense because it was just, there was no real way to kind of own it in a sense that would preserve longevity. Now that we have those new characteristics, I think it's shifting it, and then the broader cultural shift, of course, is that more and more of our lives are moving online, especially with COVID. More and more people were spending time in the digital world, perhaps even more than the physical world. So that macro trend is, of course, this like overarching shift in terms of culture.
That makes complete sense. Kind of related to this, yesterday I was actually revisiting Eugene Wei's whole like status as a service article, and it was talking about the transition between if a social network that is status oriented gets too big, then it starts to need to transition to become a utility in a certain way. So I'm curious how you think about that with OpenSea as well, because right now I think people are buying like huge volumes of very expensive items and very exclusive items on the platform. But is there a world where there's also fungible tokens? Like there are items that are fungible, not necessarily unique, but still something that people want to transact and sell on a marketplace. And then two is, what does a more utilitarian version of OpenSea look like? And is that something you guys are interested in exploring?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, today we already have items that have multiple copies. So it's not like every item is one of a kind. So that does exist today. And that can be a really healthy way to make the market more accessible to people who aren't going to spend, millions of dollars on something. That being said, I do think that there are some very interesting technical limitations to the current blockchain leaders that are driving up prices and making the barriers to entry high, which is why at OpenSea, we've always really been excited about lowering those barriers to entry through multiple mechanisms. One is layer twos on top of Ethereum that dramatically lower the transaction costs of purchasing an item or creating an item. And then the second is other layer one blockchains that allow the sort of start fresh from Ethereum and allow for kind of a new design space and a much lower transaction cost. So for example, we recently launched Polygon, our marketplace, where we re-architected a lot of how the marketplace works to ensure that users wouldn't have to pay gas costs and basically leveraging this lower cost environment. And there we're seeing some really interesting activity in gaming. So a lot of games are launching on Polygon. It's a much earlier blockchain, but it's really exciting to see the early activity there. And so I do think that part of the key to unlocking a more accessible NFT world is some of these layer twos and layer one solutions.
That's great to hear. Well, so speaking of gaming, I know that in a previous interview you had mentioned that you actually expected the gaming use case to take off before art got super mainstream. What do you think kind of made the adoption a little bit lower? And are you actually seeing a critical mass of demand or a good enough user experience for NFTs to be integrated in a lot of these mass market games, or do you feel like it's still going to take a while?
With gaming, my theory is that a lot of it has to do with the development time for games. It's a lot longer than art. Obviously, with art, you can just go and mint. Obviously, you have to think it through, but you can ultimately just kind of mint it and sell it to your fans. With gaming, you have to go and build a really high quality game. And our thesis has always been that the most exciting games would come from new developers as opposed to existing ones, because they're more willing to kind of embrace what's new about NFTs. And if you think about game economies, they're sort of these giant, complicated economies, but they're completely centrally controlled by the game developer. And going from like a centrally controlled economy like Fortnite to suddenly opening it up is really challenging. So instead, we think like starting with an open economy from the beginning is a really interesting way to go. So projects like Decentraland or the Sandbox or Crypto Voxels are all embracing that approach, and they are really growing and continuing to develop. And then new projects that are taking maybe a similar approach by starting with an open world economy, I think are really exciting. And I think it just takes time for these things to develop. And sure, certainly the technical limitations of the blockchain have made it challenging, but I do think that we're pretty close to solving some of those problems.
What are the main contributors? Like, so you mentioned creation as kind of a barrier. It's much easier to make, a 2D flat piece of art than a 3D object that's going to be rendered in a 3D world. What are some of the tools or platforms that people are using right now to mint a game-oriented NFT?
For game-oriented NFTs, I believe most folks are actually just building their own contracts, right? Because they typically have a development team to go and do it, versus on the art front, a lot of folks use platforms like ours to create. So that's my sense. I'm sure there are some games that use Minter tools, but yeah, I think there's sort of there's an opportunity for people to build more infrastructure for game developers to more easily integrate blockchain. But I do think some of that will just come from the natural evolution of blockchain infrastructure getting easier and easier for regular developers to interact with and build on.
You also talk about the fact that it's going to be way easier to integrate with foundationally decentralized gaming platforms. But at the same time, I think that companies like Roblox, Fortnite, Minecraft, they are gaining more traction than they ever have, and will still be a huge part of how people spend their times. And so if you were to think about integrating NFTs onto those platforms, what would that require? Is there a world where it could also be kind of hybrid, where there is a closed marketplace on Fortnite, for example, but then people can still somehow introduce NFTs that they buy off of OpenSea? How does the mechanics of that look like?
Yeah, certainly. I think for sure there are, in fact, we've already seen a number of like hybrid approaches where there's sort of a centralized in-game marketplace, but then you can export to the blockchain. And I think those are viable options. It might be challenging for a super large company to do that in like a comprehensive way, but certainly one thing you could imagine. Actually, if you look at kind of Reddit's NFT integration, I think it's a perfect example.
Wait, they have an NFT integration?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's basically you can buy a special avatar I don't know if you saw that Reddit launched this like avatar thing where you can like customize your avatar. So you can do that for free. But then if you want to buy, more exclusive rare avatar, you can go and buy it as an NFT on OpenSea. There's only maybe 5 or 6 of these rare avatars, but you can imagine them rolling out more and more. So there's an interesting hybrid approach where a lot of it's free and centralized, but then the sort of more premium stuff is traded on or bought and sold on open marketplaces. So yeah, I think we've already seen a number of games that have a centralized primary system, and then they allow you to export for maybe the higher value assets.
Good for Reddit for doing that. So more on just like the beauty of populating NFTs within virtual worlds. I know you're really excited about it. I'm personally really excited about it. But right now it feels like it's hard to showcase your NFT, right? There's not really good galleries or museums or places that are largely visited that have that exposure awareness that you want to show off how much, you paid for something. But what is interesting about gaming is that it's going to be high exposure places that people go to. So walk me through how you imagine the evolution of NFTs in virtual worlds, that being like, what are some principles that you have to think about? Is there a sense of property rights? Is there a sense of rent even? Like, what if people walk by your NFT house all the time, and as a result, you like collect rent if they like stay there for a while? Just potential concepts that might emerge in these worlds as a result of being in a digitally native world using digitally native items.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think at a high level, one of the interesting pieces here, and I'm not a game developer, so I'm just sort of riffing here, and I also haven't done like a ton of research into virtual world design outside of the blockchain. But I do think the interesting thing is you can take the existing principles and patterns from the physical world and move them into the digital, but you probably don't want to move all of them over, right? Like, for example, in the digital world, creating something beautiful and distributing it to many people is completely free, right? Whereas in the physical world, if you create a painting, well, you have to replicate it physically and then send it out and all these things, right? So you want to kind of keep in mind that you don't want to restrain people too much by saying that like physical resources are always limited or something. Like you want to kind of give people that unbridled creativity. But of course, you also want to kind of create scarcity and value in this world. So, I think you want to have patterns around pointing to a few instances of this. If you look at crypto voxels or Decentraland, you can create whatever you want inside of your virtual land. You're not like resource limited, but of course the land itself is scarce, right? The world is only so large. And then when you bring in NFTs into the world, they sort of have this special presentation where they're like outlined by like a shiny border. And so there's a sort of like known presentation of an NFT that makes it different than just like some random chair inside of the world. So I think that's an interesting pattern where, you still have the abundance of a digital universe, but then you have these specific things that are rare. So in the case of CryptoVoxels, it's like the land and the NFTs are rare. Decentraland has also done some interesting stuff where they have rare clothing. So, they have a set of clothing that you can just try on and put on your avatar, but then you can buy a wearable if you want to, dress up in a special way or something like that. So I think we're sort of starting to see those basic mechanics play out in some of these virtual worlds, but ultimately it's kind of the sky's the limit and it's still really up for exploration.
Yeah, I didn't realize that they actually highlighted which thing is an NFT and what is not. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So I hinted at this a little bit, but have you guys thought about the idea of licensing and what that would mean? So like, for example, you have a really, really valuable piece of artwork or you have a really special, expensive item from Sandbox and you want to lend that to somebody else for whatever reason. Is that a technology that is easily enabled? What would that look like? Have you guys thought about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think to talk about the lending idea for sure, I think, one of the really cool things about these open economies is you can have sort of more of that activity that you'd see in the physical world happen inside of a virtual environment. Let's say you own a piece of land in Decentraland, maybe you can lend it out to someone or lease it out, right? And you can sort of have that interesting economic activity take place. The other idea is, in the same way that you could lend someone your Pokemon cards or your Magic the Gathering cards, now that they're NFTs, you could do that. And the cool thing about NFTs is that the moment you build the application for lending, it applies to every single type of NFT. Licenses, I think, yeah, certainly it's an interesting idea. I think we're seeing kind of some early exploration in like you buy the NFT and you get the actual license to particular work. But I would say it's early days. Most of the NFTs are more like you own these in the sense that you own a game item or a piece of art. You don't necessarily own the rights to distribute it or those sorts of things.
Oh, that's interesting. That actually makes me wonder about music. So you did mention that there are now musicians who are minting NFTs as well. What does it mean to make a piece of music into an NFT right now? Right? Like you can't just own the music and then not do anything with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the project, right? So in some cases, like it could just be a pure collectible, right? Let's say a famous musician wants to issue 100 of their album art to their biggest fan. You're buying the album art, but you're just buying it for its collectible sake because you don't own anything special with regards to the rights. Like, I think that's what we're seeing the most of is sort of appealing to this high-end, super engaged collector base that wants to own something special from the musician, but they're not actually buying any rights.
Okay, so what you're saying is that in the music space, it's actually mostly just like fan swag and stuff. It's right not now. The music itself. Because exactly. I actually imagine, like, what would it mean if Taylor Swift decided to take all her music off Spotify today and then decide to mint them as NFTs and then have, like, the ultimate control of every single impression of that piece of music? I'm guessing that's not possible right now.
It's an interesting idea. I don't know enough about the music industry to really say, but it sounds like it would probably require a lot of coordination with existing, like, Spotify or anywhere that is, using.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, let's switch gears and talk a bit more about NFTs for real world things. So right now, people are creating these like digital twins for a lot of things. I'm not actually super sure what the most common use cases are, but can you walk us through some of these use cases where somebody is creating a digital representation of a physical good? Is this actually useful? Like, what kind of opportunities does this impact for people?
Sure. So I think there's sort of two things that people are doing. One is they're saying, I'm an artist and I'm going to sell an NFT, right? And this NFT will come with both the physical piece of art and the NFT digital thing, right? And so that's kind of an interesting thing because you're buying basically the physical and digital twins together. And the other thing that's really interesting is issuing an NFT that represents a physical item that is custodied elsewhere. We've had a couple of experiments where people will sell, a physical shirt, but you're buying the NFT, which can be redeemed for the physical item, but it could also be resold before it's redeemed, right? So that shirt could actually be bought and sold many times before it's redeemed. And that's a really interesting idea too, because you can basically have this marketplace for the item before you need to actually transfer it from one person to another. So I think both of those ideas are really interesting, and we're seeing exploration on both fronts.
Yeah, I don't want to go back to art again, but it does feel like art is a really good use case, like physical art, because it's so expensive and so fragile to transport. And so a lot of people just want to know that they own that piece of art. A lot of art is in storage as well, rather than needing to have a container or have a display for it.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about what it means now that OpenSea is on the Apple Store. So you guys released the app recently. It was a very exciting moment. What does it mean for transactions be taken on the OpenSea app when it is on the App Store? Does Apple take a cut of that? What does the transaction look like?
Sure. Yeah. So currently the OpenSea app only allows you to explore NFTs. So one important thing about OpenSea is we're not just a marketplace. We're actually a place where you can go and look up pretty much any NFT on the Ethereum and the other blockchains we support. So our app currently doesn't allow you to purchase the items, but you can go and display, you can go and find things, you can go and look around. And so we're still figuring out what's the best way to work with the platforms to provide the actual buying and selling experience. But currently it's just sort of a starting point.
If there was a world where that needed to happen, I'm guessing the two systems are not really congruent with each other, right? It just wouldn't work.
No, we could make it work. Well, I think there's some challenges, but there are ways to make it work.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Like out of the gate, it is complicated for sure.
Okay. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is creators. So you mentioned before that artists can already create on OpenSea. I don't know what that actually means, but are you guys expanding the set of creator tools or the set of creating integrations or partner platforms to really facilitate and seed more creations on OpenSea?
Yeah, so we are doing a lot to work more directly with creators and partners. So everyone from the small indie artist who wants to get their work out to the world, we're always excited about featuring those types of folks on our homepage, for example, to the larger brands and musicians and athletes and influencers that already have pre-existing audiences. So yeah, we've really been working to work with those folks, give them exposure, give them the tools they need to be successful. It's been a lot of fun getting to meet a lot of really interesting people in the space.
That's awesome. What is something that people should understand about NFTs or the industry at large that you're really excited about that people don't really necessarily ask you about or isn't part of the conversation around NFTs?
I think one of the most challenging things for people to wrap their heads around with NFTs is that they are so general and have so many different use cases that it's not, I think sometimes there are kind of questions around like, oh, could an NFT do this or could an NFT do that? Or like, how does an NFT work in this context? And the answer is often not maybe the most satisfying answer, but it's really that it could be whatever you want, right? I think that's the power of it, right? Is that this is a very generic, low level primitive for digital ownership on the internet. And that applies to so many different things, which is why I think the opportunity and sort of the shift we're seeing in NFTs is representative of just like a giant shift in the architecture of the internet. So I think sometimes people miss the forest for the trees and think it's only about specifically like creators or specifically royalties or specifically artists, when those are all extremely exciting applications, but the use cases go much further beyond that.
Yeah, that's a super good point. So speaking of which, like when it comes to economic opportunities or even new jobs and new roles or new platforms that needs to be seeded within the industry, what are the things that you foresee? One is like, what kind of jobs will there be in the future as this thing sprawls throughout the internet? And then two is OpenSea is only going to play some roles in facilitating the industry, but what are other key platforms or technologies that you think need to emerge?
Got it. So the first question was sort of around what are the jobs that might exist? When you look at NFTs today, you already see a glimpse of it, right? You see artists and creators who are spending sometimes 100% of their time in the NFT space creating, right? And so a lot of the jobs that people have dreamed about for a long time, virtual artists or virtual reality sculpture artists, things like that, I think are starting to emerge because the creativity that people have had locked up for a long time, the channels for that have mainly been things like social media, digital art contract work. There have been vehicles for it, but this is a new vehicle where people can really express that creativity and do it in a way that engages the rest of the economy, folks who can support them and have real economic activity around it. So I think there's going to be a whole set of jobs around that. I think game developers are really going to flourish in this environment. So everyone from the actual software developers who are building the games to the artists to the creators who are helping those worlds come alive. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting activity in music for sure. So already a lot of musicians are starting to really take this technology seriously and think about how they can use it as a platform to start their careers. So those are some of the jobs that come to mind. I think some of them are starting to emerge already. The other area that you mentioned, which is what role can OpenSea play, and then what role can other companies play? At OpenSea, we are really laser focused on the marketplace. So trying to, in the near term, build the best possible marketplace for users. And so we've always really been supportive of other applications that help us achieve that mission. So wallets, for example, there's now many different types of wallets where users can store their NFTs and interact with decentralized applications. And we think for a while, at least, the wallets will be their own kind of set of applications separate from the marketplace. Creator tools, we have some creator tools on OpenSea, but certainly there's room for lots of different tools for creators. Game developers are obviously another set of companies that will emerge. So, we really want to build the best marketplace, and we have ambitions to build things beyond that too. It's just such a early space, and we really think there's a lot of opportunity across the board.
Right on. My next question is a little bit more philosophical. So obviously you're very deep into the whole digital ownership as well as the metaverse space right now. And there's a lot of controversy around it, right? I think people are worried about this future where we're purely plugged into this dystopian virtual world. I think there's a lot of conversation around the negative climate implications around crypto and the blockchain and stuff like that. What's your stance on your positioning in the industry? What would you say is the reason why it is important that a lot of this stuff is happening? And then also maybe, things that you would caution people around and are actually important things to think about as we progress more on metaverse developments.
I would say, I think the reason it's important is if you look at kind of the landscape of the internet, and you also think about how the internet has just become a more and more important piece of our lives, right? We're spending so much time on all these platforms. And then you think about, okay, well, what are the incentives and parties who are in control of the landscape of the internet? Well, it's a few centralized institutions, your Google, your Facebook, your Amazon, et cetera. These companies have done a lot of great for the world, but they also have interesting incentive structure, right? If you think about Facebook, for example, they're really monetizing user attention in the form of their advertising-based business model. Economic landscape of the internet has actually been quite limited by some of these constraints, right? So the fact that there was no sort of native digital ownership or native digital currency on the internet created this freemium model that eventually led to advertisement-based business models. And that made sense for some of the early evolutions of the internet. But now that we have some of these new primitives, we can reimagine and build on top of the foundations of the internet that have been started by these bigger internet companies and rethink, well, maybe there are different business models that lead to more value accruing to the users themselves, right? And maybe those business models don't monetize user attention, but rather, lead to much different economic incentives. So I think it's really a reimagination of the internet, and as a result, a reimagination of a lot of how society is structured. And then on the sort of climate front, I think that's a problem that is being solved. It's a super important one, and it's one that's being solved by technology. So if you look at the evolution of blockchains, the first iteration, was much more intensive from an energy standpoint, but the next iterations are not, right? As an industry, we are moving towards a much more energy efficient future for blockchains. And I think that's part of kind of the natural evolution of the space.
That's very well put. My last question to you, kind of a fun question, is have you ever minted your own NFT? And if so, what's the one that you're the most proud of?
Yeah, a while back, I minted an NFT that was like, if you bought it, you would get 30 minutes of my crypto startup advice. This was a long time ago. And a few people bought it, so it was a lot of fun. And then I minted NFTs to like test out the site and stuff like that.
Wait, how do you mint that? Because once that's over, what does it mean? You could just say that you
just
did
send it back to me. So basically you buy it, and then if you want to redeem it, you just send it back to me, and then I just keep it, or I can put it on sale again and someone else can buy it.
Interesting. That actually gives me a good idea of like if Calendly was based on the value of your own social token. Yeah. So the time of 30 minutes might change the more popular you get. Okay, one follow-up to that. If you were to spend all of your time minting NFTs or really dedicating your life towards a certain use case of NFTs, what would it be?
I think event ticketing is cool. So going and kind of working with a lot of events and conferences on, making their tickets NFTs. I think that would be a cool use case.
Right on. That's awesome. Well, I've learned so much. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
That was Devin Finzer, CEO of OpenSea. You can find him on Twitter at dfinzer, or you can check out OpenSea.com or the mobile app and browse and buy some cool NFTs. You can currently get the cheapest Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT for the low price of around $200,000. Yep, you've heard me right. If you liked this episode, please help leave a review in your podcast app of choice. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. This is your host, Annie Zhang, and I will see you in 2 weeks.